Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for March 2nd, 2021. What I'm going to talk about today is how there's an effort to censor and silence the truth about what's happening with the energy systems in our country and the economy in general. There are big lies that are being perpetrated to divert attention from the ongoing systemic collapse of the physical economy of the United States and the West as a whole. The question that comes up, as you'll see, is will the big tech companies censor discussion about the failure of the so-called renewable systems, such as those which triggered the Texas deep freeze collapse of 2 weeks ago? And also, what about economic policy? We're being told that the economy is in good shape because the stock market's going up. Do you believe that? Do you fall for that? Now, these are some of the discussion topics that have to come up. And when we look at it, we're going to take a look at something that came from the Washington Post, which of course is owned by Jeff Bezos, who until recently was the CEO of Amazon, one of the big tech companies. So why should we be surprised to find lies in the Washington Post? But let's start with the whole question of why it is that they can get away with some of this. Most of you are unfortunately focused on the gyrations, the ups and downs of the stock market. We're seeing a continuation of a bubble that's inflated by huge volumes of free credit going into the hands of speculators from the Federal Reserve through the main money center banks of the United States. There are also ups and downs of other speculative investments in precious metals, gold and silver, Bitcoin, and so on. And it's true, some big investors are making money. Is this a sign of actual economic progress, economic growth? The point is, bubbles will always pop. The question is, how do you know if something is a bubble? Well, the current monetary manipulation is based on several measures that have been taken progressively since the 1971 shutdown of the Bretton Woods system. And so what we've seen is a move toward privatization, deregulation, and financialization, which base the economic statistics and accounting methods on the amounts of money, monetary policy, and not fiscal policy or physical policy. That is the actual production of necessary goods, and more importantly, the investment in the science and technology to produce increased potential to produce those goods in the future. In other words, to increase the rate of growth at which the rate of growth of capital goods can be increased. So the headlines are on monetary manipulation, on the stock market, on the ups and downs, the daily tips that you get with the idea that maybe you'll hit a big one and become rich. But while this has been going on, there's a growing gap between rich and poor because this is a game that favors those who have lots of money and have the ability to control and manipulate policy. So what we've seen, deregulation, privatization, financialization, this is the reality that is accepted by almost everyone. This is called neoliberalism, the idea that the government should play no role in economic policy and that it should be left to the market to determine pricing, to determine the distribution of wealth. And what is the market? Is it some God-given outside invisible hand, as Adam Smith tried to explain it? Or is it the invisible hand that's in your pocket, taking your potential for future benefits in order to feed the speculative monster? Now, the way to look at this, excuse me, and the only way of looking at reality is through something Lyndon LaRouche developed in the mid-1990s called his triple curve function, which looked at the interrelationship between three aspects of economics. One is the monetary curve, how much money is in circulation. The second is the financial curve, how much printing is going on based on future expectations of revenue. but not necessarily anything of underlying value. This is where financialization comes in. You create something, a so-called derivative, for example, is derived from something of value but has no value in itself. That is, the determining of its price depends on speculators' willingness to pay something for it as opposed to any useful value it provides for an economy. So what we've seen since LaRouche developed this curve is the monetary curve going up, the financial curve going up, and the production curve accelerating downward. This is what we've seen from outsourcing, from deindustrialization, the outsourcing of industry, which has denuded the so-called Rust Belt of its productive enterprises, but also disinvestment, because with privatization, where you deregulate so there's no longer a responsibility to upgrade, to improve, to protect existing methods of service, for example, in transportation or in electrical delivery. Once you take away the demand through regulation that there be constant investment to upgrade a system, then private companies can make profits by disinvesting, by not spending to modernize or even winterize. We just saw that in Texas. So what happens is that you can make short-term profits, including large profits, through this system, while passing the effect of this off into the future, when inevitably the systems will collapse. And whoever's left holding the buck then is the loser. And as we've seen since especially 2008, but even going back to the 1990s with LTCM and the various, the Russian bond crisis, what did we see then? Government bailouts through the big banks. That is, the big banks were bailed out so they could bail out the speculators. But the system continued. They never put these swindlers through bankruptcy reorganization or court cases. So the swindle continued, and the volume of debt has grown while the productive capability of the economy has declined. And this is a form of primitive accumulation. And LaRouche developed a concept which is necessary for electricity, necessary for energy production, that of energy flux density. That it's through increases in the energy flux density of a system that you increase the potential productivity of that system. If you take away from that, you end up reducing the efficiency of the system as a whole, which is why we cannot go to so-called renewables, because they're inefficient and they're also unreliable, as we saw in the Texas deep freeze. Now, what I reported on this and what we've been reporting, and it's also there in our special report, the Executive Intelligence Review special report, The Great Leap Backwards, is that it's a deliberate policy to reduce the energy flux density of the system, because the people who control the global financial cartels of banking, of finance, of insurance, of energy, of raw materials, of big pharma, they're going to make money by depleting the human population because it lowers their costs. And if they can keep people working in slave labor at increasingly inefficient systems, more people will die. But their profits will go up because their costs will drop. That's the whole point behind the green energy phenomena, the fraud of the Green New Deal, and also deregulation. Now the question is, are we going to be allowed to report on this? Let me just give you an example of this danger of censorship from an article in the Washington Post about the Texas deep freeze, in which they took up a story from the German Marshall Fund in Washington, essentially calling for censorship. What they said is that they attacked Governor Abbott of Texas, who said that nearly all the wind power in the state failed, and that's what caused the blackouts. And the Washington Post wrote, "The recent explosion of falsehoods related to the Texas power outages highlights how climate science and related topics like renewable energy are a ripe target for online propaganda. Tech companies have not been aggressive in stepping up their defenses against climate disinformation, despite increasing public pressure from environmental activists to do more." In other words, there should be more lies to cover up what actually happened. Now, you even see this as the article continues. Listen to this. Researchers from the Marshall Fund are especially concerned about the wind turbine claims because they weren't completely fabricated. In other words, wind power failed. It did fail. They go on to say, they quote someone from the Marshall Fund, the authors, I guess, Goldstein and Wiener. This kind, or they say that they weren't completely fabricated. Instead, they were manipulated to serve the political goal of undermining Democrats' efforts to fund renewable energy sources. The quote is, "This kind of manipulative content can be even more pernicious because it maintains an element of truth." In other words, if you tell the truth, it would cause the whole green agenda to be rejected. Therefore, what's the conclusion? Well, let's go a little further, because 2 days later they had a chart which said that it showed what happened to electricity generation in Texas, and what they were calling climate disinformation actually was a chart from the power generation of the Electric Reliability Council showed that while nuclear and coal power continued to function, wind power dropped to near zero from the 14th of February to the 15th. And that as a result of this, the disappearance of wind turbine power triggered the Texas disaster. There's no other conclusion you can make from looking at the facts from this chart that was produced. Now, so what's their conclusion? Well, you cannot allow these kinds of facts to get out. For the moment, they're not censoring the charges about the failure of the wind turbines. Maybe this report will be censored. But if you actually look at the figures, the drop to zero of wind energy was a crucial factor in the blackouts in Texas. But add the second factor, which they're also completely keeping out of the discussion, deregulation. By allowing the electric distribution companies to not have to invest in upkeep, in upgrading, in winterizing, they were unprepared for the extreme weather. Well, regulation is put there to protect the population from just such extremes, so that instead of profiting by not investing in necessary infrastructure, companies are forced to invest in infrastructure. That's the American system. If you don't do it, you have catastrophes. Will this be censored? Well, that's the question that we're looking at right now. But what we're talking about here when we look at this Washington Post article, it's not a matter of opinion. There are facts that back it up. Facts that the Washington Post editors who answer to Jeff Bezos and his big tech company Amazon don't want you to know. That's why you need the Executive Intelligence Review's report, The Great Leap Backwards, to find out who's who in pushing the Green New Deal, what their intention is, the genocidal intent of this, what the results will be if we don't stop it, and then what the alternatives are. Lyndon LaRouche's movement has always stood for this idea of investment in future technologies, in increasing energy flux density, and has never supported policies that bring cheap profit through speculation. The idea that the stock market growth, whether it was under Obama or whether it was under Donald Trump, the idea that that's a sign of positive economic development is a fraud, as President Trump understood when he attacked Hillary Clinton in 2016 for proclaiming that Obama engineered a recovery because of the increase of valuation on the stock market. That fraud, unfortunately, was continued during the Trump administration when we were told we had a booming economy. Some sectors did improve. There were some increases in jobs, minor increases in productivity gain, which leveled off and then started dropping before the COVID crisis, and are being used as the basis of the so-called Great Reset to give all power to the central banks and to censor anyone who speaks against it. So use this video to show your friends what we're facing: a bunch of lying media who are acting on behalf of corporate cartels who are looting the population, looting the infrastructure for the sake of private gain, and using neoliberal economics, the idea of deregulation and privatization and competition, as a snow job So you won't see that what we're really talking about is the so-called invisible hand in the market reaching into your bank account and stealing whatever you have left. Thanks for joining me. I'm sorry I'm a little bit long today, but this is an important topic. This gets to the heart of LaRouche's economics, the real Lyndon LaRouche's economic policy. Don't be fooled by any phony. It's physical economy, stupid. Thanks a lot. I'll join you again tomorrow.